Hello, everyone. Welcome to very hot and muggy Beijing. It's good to have you here. I tried to do my best to give you a nice little environment. We're going to talk about Chinese painting today, and the reason that I chose Chinese painting was because I recall when we were in Lausanne last year. I spent a lot of time. Like walking through the mountains and drawing pictures of the mountains, and I saw this class, the results of what this class had done the week previous, and I thought, "Ooh, if I have to do that, I know exactly what I'm going to do. It's going to be about showing Chinese painting in such a wonderful environment." So the wonderful environment we're in today is the virtual environment. All right, so now I started Chinese painting almost immediately when I came, and I continue to do it today, and I do a little bit. I do some of the traditional things, and I also use it for contemporary things as well. Today, what we're going to talk about is the traditional things. So, first thing is the materials. I'm going to move my camera around here so you can see. Oh, well, there's the kitchen. All right, and so what we have here is a handful of things. Now, I'm going to show you the traditional things that are needed, as well as how you can substitute. So let's look at the traditional things. First thing you got here is the ink, the Chinese ink. This is the big difference between like the Chinese and the Japanese and the Korean ink and the ink that we're used to in the West for writing, is that it's not waterproof. The India ink and the comic ink, that's all waterproof ink. It has like a lacquer in it so that when you paint it onto paper or draw it onto paper and it gets wet, it doesn't run again. But if you do that with Chinese ink, it'll run again. It's not waterproof. And then here are the brushes. This brush here, one of my favorite brushes. I've had it for going on probably 15 years now. And then this one here is just sort of your classic student brush. And both of them work really well. I'm not going to go into the finer points of brushes. You can save that for a type 2 activity if you like. These brushes in Asia, they're really easy to find and they're really inexpensive. I have found, at least in the United States, I had a hard time finding good brushes. You kind of found one type, and they didn't seem to be so good, and there was really only one choice. So if you don't have a Chinese brush, then you can always use a watercolor brush, and I'm going to get to the watercolor brush in a minute. I'll just set that aside. Brushes last a long time. Like I said, if you take care of them and it's just a matter of cleaning them with water and letting them dry flat, then they're good. The next thing is, now I have, this thing is called an inkstone. You don't have to have an inkstone. You get all, if you want to get traditional the Chinese painting, use one of these. And these can get, this one was inexpensive, but these can get super expensive. This is an art form in and of itself. However, if you don't have an inkstone, and when I first studied, I didn't have an inkstone, but then neither did my teacher, who had been teaching it for years. He used a plate, just a regular dish sort of plate that kind of had a little bit of a raised edge to it, and that was good enough. And that's what he taught me on, and that's what he used. So, while this is really cool and nifty to have, it's not required. You can get away without it. And then the next thing is the paper. Now, the paper, in English, at least in the United States, we call it rice paper. And truth is, it's not actually made out of rice. It's made out of bamboo. And other things. There's lots of secret recipes. The story I heard is the reason that it was called rice paper is because as foreigners were coming into East Asia, the people who were making the paper wanted to keep their recipes a secret. So they told them it was made from something different. Yeah. Now, there is actually, it's again, like if you're in the West, I don't know about the Middle East or South America or Africa, it's sometimes difficult to find decent Chinese paper. And it's pretty easy to find Japanese paper, but Japanese paper is different. Japanese paper is made out of mulberry. It has some different characteristics to it. You're welcome to use it. It works just fine, but it's a little different, so you might have to play around with it, get used to it. Now, if you do not have access to all this stuff, that's not a big deal. You can do, what we're going to do is we're really just going to look at painting techniques and style and composition. So, you know, it's not necessary to have a paper. You can get away with watercolors. And I have here, watercolors come in all different shapes and sizes. This is my watercolor set. It's just a set of cakes. You know, you can use any color you want, really. We're going to use the black today because it's more like what we're doing. And then there's also tube watercolor. You'll need a palette. This is like a travel set, so it's kind of nifty. It comes with a palette. But again, if you don't have a palette, a dish. A dish will work just as well, so long as the water doesn't soak in. And of course, you need paper, right? And so this is again, I just pulled out my travel set because the watercolor paper I have that's not in the travel set is like big. But this is just a book full of watercolor paper. In fact, this is the book that I had in Lausanne last year. And, you know, I went up to the top of the mountain where, and drew some pictures, and I got a whole bunch of flowers. But a watercolor paper, it's kind of heavy. It'll warp a little bit when you're painting on it, but it'll dry flat. And, you know, which is a nice thing. It's got little bumps in it. I'm sure you can't see, but it's got little bumps in it. Now, if you don't have access to watercolor, oh, I didn't show you the brush. Here's the watercolor brush, all right, just a soft watercolor brush. I actually had a hard time finding one of these because I don't use them anymore because the Chinese brushes tend to work just as well for watercolor as they do for Chinese painting. So I've just kind of turned into these. This is sort of a repurposed brush that I use for oil painting, but as long as it's clean and it's not sticky at the end, it's okay, you can use it, all right? Now, if you're absolutely out of watercolors and Chinese ink, actually what we're going to do, you can also do with the marker. This is, you know, it's got a little bit of a tip to it, but this is just kind of a standard, you know, art marker. And you could probably even get away with those big Crayola markers. Those would work too. The effect will be different. It'll look a little different, but the way that we're going to paint and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it will work exactly the same. So even if all you have is a marker and some like bond copy paper, you can still participate. All right, so let's talk about composition. Now what I'm going to show you is just traditional composition rules. There's plenty of painters that use these rules and break these rules. You feel free to use them and break them as you wish. In fact, and what I'm going to show you too is really specific to Chinese style. In Japanese style or in Korean style, there's a little bit different rules. You know, there's alterations in that suit their cultures. Just, you know, their history better. So the first thing to think about when you're doing Chinese painting is to keep in mind that the things that are closest to the viewer are at the bottom of your composition, right? The bottom of your picture plane. And the things that are furthest from the viewer are up at the top, all right? So close at the bottom, far at the top, all right? Another thing to think about is that a lot of times the organization of the elements, and an element is just the things and the stuff inside the painting, the organization tends to follow an S-curve or a type of S-curve. And that means that when you're designing your painting, you want the viewer to kind of go on this nice journey throughout the painting. You want them to follow kind of this nice curve, all right? So that the eye maybe starts down here and it moves over here to the rock, and then it comes up along that line of the rock and goes up to the trees, and then these branches of the trees point it to the cliff over here, right? So there's our S curve. Now, some you can do an S curve. You can just do kind of like a big S. Some do like a double S, so it makes kind of this sort of thing. Sometimes when the painting is only like half the size, they cut the S in half too, so it just kind of forms a C, kind of a very elaborate C, I suppose. This is designed, you know, this idea, this concept that the viewer, when they look at your painting, they go on an adventure. You know, they go on a journey. They travel through the landscape, or they travel through the still life. We'll get into that in a little bit. Also, you should want to keep like a pretty even balance between black. You know, you want some areas where the ink is really black, and then you want some light grays in there, and then you also, or I'm sorry, you want some dark grays in there, and then you also want to have some light grays in there. And you keep kind of an even balance between that, so that, you know, if it's too much black, it's too powerful. If it's too much of the light gray or even the dark gray, it's too soft. It doesn't make a strong enough impression on the viewer. According to the traditional rules, you're allowed to, like I said, you're allowed to break these rules. And also, you want to have space. You know, you want to keep it. I always tell my students, not just with Chinese painting, but just with any kind of drawing or painting in general, the comfortable feeling, if you want to make a comfortable looking painting, is to have like a 70-30 balance. So either 70% elements, remember elements are stuff, right? 70% elements and 30% empty space, or vice versa. You could have 30% stuff and 70% empty space. So we're going to talk a little bit about subject matter now. So the subject matter is the thing that the painting is of. All right. So again, there are three classic subject matters in Chinese painting. One is called shanshui, and that's like mountain water. That's what it translates to. But oh no, that's the literal translation. The translation should be landscape painting. All right. So when you're painting a landscape, you're painting trees, you're painting mountains, you're painting rocks or forests or meadows. All that falls into the category of landscape painting. All right. This one's a little tougher to see because it's big and my apartment is small. But another type of category of subject matter is still life painting. In Chinese, it translates to huaniao, which means bird and flower, which is probably something that you'll see if you read any art history textbooks. But more or less, it translates to still life painting. So a vase of flowers, some things sitting on your table, stuff like that. If anybody was in Lausanne last year, you remember T, she'd make flower arrangements on the table in the classroom. And one of those days, while I was attentively listening, I was also drawing a picture of one of her flower arrangements. And then when I got back to Beijing, I did a larger painting of it. So there's a third category of subject matter for Chinese painting, and it's one I almost never do. So I don't have a personal example to show you, but I do have a book full of plenty of examples, and that's called, just like it's called figure painting. It translates to renwu, but we can talk about it as portraiture or people. It doesn't necessarily have to be a portrait of a person. So here's one. I've got a Chinese auction book, right? There's one type of renwu painting. It's got a little bit of shanshui in there, right? It's got a little bit of landscape, and they common subject matters are scholars, and then also meinu, or beautiful women, right? And these are just some examples of renwu painting, or people, figures. All right, so we're going to talk about holding the brush, and this is where it gets into. Even if you're doing this with a marker, please give a go at holding the brush the way that I'm going to show you, because now we're getting into kind of that nitty-gritty of the actual techniques and the styles. So this is the general hold for the brush. Now, what I'm doing is I'm using my thumb here, right, and I'm pressing about the middle of the shaft of the brush, and I'm pressing it into my fingers, and then I'm using my fingers. And I'm doing the same thing with the brush, so I'm into the thumb. So I'm pressing into it. I'm using that shaft to hold it. And you're holding the brush straight up and down to begin with, all right? Now, there's a reason for this, all right? It's because when you paint, we're laying the paper down on the table, all right? There you go. There's my paper. We're laying the paper down on the table, and when we're holding the brush perpendicular to the paper, and we're holding the brush like this, it gives us all this range of motion. In fact, we can kind of go every which direction that we want. When you're painting, think of every joint every joint as a way that you can pivot the brush. And that means your fingers, right? Your wrist, even your elbow, your shoulder, right? All of this works. Now, I probably won't use the shoulder today because the paper's small. You know, I'll use my shoulder with the paper that is much larger. And then I've never done this. I'm kind of like to try sometime. There's even very, very large paintings, right, where you have to stand up and hold the brush. So not only are you using your knuckles and your wrist and your elbow and your shoulder, you even putting your hips into it. All right. So I'm not going to paint anything in particular. I'm just going to show you kind of some of the strokes here. So just give you the idea, right? So if I can move my brush, if I can kind of, you can see I've got a lot of different range of motion, right? And I can use the whole brush. You know, there's me using the elbow, and I can paint in every which way. I can make the paint go. All right, and that's why we hold the brush or the marker or the watercolor brush the way that we do, because it's just sort of the other way. Now you could get into looking at art history and seeing all different painters have all different ways of doing it, and of course discover for your own, find something that's comfortable. You know, you can hold the brush way up here, that kind of gives you a lighter, softer effect. You can hold it down here, that makes it a little bit more precise. Another technique that I found, especially, I'll get into this a little bit later, you'll see me do it, is that if you want to do something that's very precise, then I've used my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand, as an anchor. I set it down, and then I rest my wrist on top of my hand, and then that gives me a nice, sturdy brace for making very delicate, very precise lines. All right, everybody, so we're going to get into the painting, and this is the fun bit of it, I think. So I've got my paper here, and I've got, this is a big piece of paper, so I'm going to pull some of it down. And I have a little scrap piece of paper over on the side here. I do that to just kind of make sure, test how much water and how much ink is on my brush. All right. Now, there are all different types of trees. The reason I kind of chose the landscape painting for us is because Lausanne has just such great landscape. And I got really excited about the tree shapes there, and I made a lot of sketches so that when I came home I could work on them. So, and recreate them. And, you know, I don't know, it's maybe the mark of someone who gets into Chinese painting. You start to really like the shapes of things like rocks and trees after a while. So, what you're going to do is, or what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk you through it here, is you're going to start with the trunk. So you go to right before the branches come off from the trunk, all right? And pull in there. I'm using the tip of my brush right now, but then maybe I'll use a little bit of the belly. That's kind of like the middle part of the brush. And I've found what kind of makes a nice, interesting looking tree is to give it a little bit of straight line and then give it a little bit of a wiggle or a twitch and then a straight line, right? And then that way it makes it sort of tree-like. So, but you do want to be careful not to have too much wiggle, especially too much wiggle opposite one another, because then it just kind of looks like this odd, shaky tree. You also want to keep in mind that your tree should get wider as it gets closer to the bottom. You can always kind of like touch it up a little bit as you go. There we go. I'm going to put in some roots where the tree meets the ground. All right. And so there we go. That's the trunk of my tree. That's the first stop. And now I'm going to work on the branches. Now the branches, at first, when they come out, they tend to be a little straighter than the trunk, right? So there'll be more quicker straight lines. And you want to keep both the lines and the shape a little bit thinner than your trunk, all right? See, and I see mine's a little bit straighter, and you work towards the trunk. So you find out where your branch is. I'm going to put a funky hitch in this one, right? And I'm going to work it on down there. And so now I'm starting to get the branches of the tree. Now, when you first start, normally leaves won't cover up this part. However, as we get into it further, you'll see you'll want to leave some space for the leaves. So I'm going to do that now. I had once one of my teachers told me when you're painting a tree to think like a tree, which I thought was a little silly when he first said it. However, as time has gone on, I'm beginning to see the wisdom in the thinking like a tree. Think about it as, you know, you're building your tree up, and you want to think about the way the tree moves and the way the tree grows and the way the branches come out, right? And so in that sense, you're kind of thinking like a tree. Now, I'm going to put some leaves in here. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space. I'm going to extend out with this kind of branch that comes out, and I'm doing a more quick, I hope you saw that, I'm doing a quick stroke there. And I'm going to do the bottom there. And then I'm going to leave some space here. And there we go. See, I can leave that little bit. I leave a little bit here where there's going to be some, I'm going to put some pine needles in there a little bit. And then I'm also going to have some pine needles here. So you're starting to sort of like build the structure of your tree, and you're giving it space for the leaves to grow. All right, and then I'm going to do the same over here. I'm going to keep them a little bit thinner. Sorry if my hand's in the way. All right, there we go, a little bit right there. Still trying not to make it too straight. You know, I want to make it an interesting knobby tree. There's a Taoist story about someone complaining that this tree was all full of knots and it was useless. It wasn't growing fruit anymore. It was too old to grow fruit, and it was like no good for wood because there were too many knots in it. And you know, the Taoist master just said, "Oh, but look at how lovely the tree looks. It's a wonderful tree to look at. It provides shade to sit under and rest and contemplate. So there's no such thing as a bad tree. There's no such thing as a useless tree." And these kind of like knobby, cragged sort of shapes are really cool. Now, we're going to go right to the bark. That's the way I always like to do it. Now, the interesting thing, right, is that there's lots and lots of different ways and different conventions of making the bark on the tree. What I'm doing is I'm watering down a little bit of ink because I want the bark to be not as dark as the edge of the tree, all right? And this paper doesn't run very much. There's some paper you got to be really careful about the water. Now, the one I like to use is to use like quick little circles. So I'm going to do that real quick here. And I'm just I'm making very quick circles with my brush. And it's sometimes nice when the brush starts to dry out a little bit, because then your circles get kind of a streaky quality to them. And that's always kind of, it's, you know, if you got little streaks in it, it makes it look a little bit more genuine. It makes it look a little more expressive. All right, there we go. I've got my tree trunk, right? I've got the branches, and we're going to do the leaves. Now, there are 101 ways to make leaves, and probably also a few more. Now, I told you I like pine trees, so I'm going to start with pine needles. All right, but we'll make this a hybrid tree. We'll make this tree a little bit of everything. All right. So pine needles go in bunches, all right? So we're going to make some quick strokes, right? And we're going to start from the outside and work in, all right? I hope this is, yeah, all right. And when you're putting your pine needles down, or this really goes for any of the leaves, you want it to just overlap a little bit. And you want to kind of think things move sort of in diagonals, like you stack your pine needles and your leaves really in diagonals, not in like a straight horizontal line. It'll look kind of odd, right? It'll look unnatural. You want it to kind of they kind of build on each other in threes, and they overlap a little bit. This can be either fantastically tedious or meditative. Now, because you're doing the kind of this repetitive motion again and again and again. I find it meditative. I like it like that. All right? And you'll notice like that there's different tones of ink. I've got a much lighter needle over here and a much darker needle over there. Remember what I said before, you want to have this nice balance between dark and light. You want some dark gray ink, you want some light gray ink, you want some black ink, all right? And you want some white space. So there we go. I've got some nifty little pine needles. I would probably, if I was working on a pine tree, I might even go here and just put a little bit of a branch that sticks out at the edge. And when I'm adding a little bit of finesse, right, to just make it a touch more interesting. Sometimes it looks really cool if you have like the pine needle or the leaf growing out of the edge of your tree here. I've got a little houseplant elm tree that has that, has like leaves growing on the bottom. Now I'm going to show you some other ways of making trees. This is going to be our hybrid tree. It's going to be a little bit of a anomaly, a natural anomaly here. So another way to make leaves, this is a fun way too, is to just do little circles. All right, just add little circles, and again, keep on that sort of diagonal approach to it. Right, so I'm going to get in here. My paper's not so flat, so I'm sorry if my hand gets in your way. And I'll add a little bit of circles to kind of bunch up my tree. This follows that same principle of it's either very meditative or it's very tedious. I think, you know, it's tedious when you first get going and when you're first trying to learn it, and it's especially annoying when you put on a bunch of leaves, you know, and you spent 45 minutes making lots of little circles, and then you realize you don't really like the shape of your tree very much. Or you put your brush down and it makes a big giant black spot that throws it off. All right, so another way of making leaves is little triangles. All right, now the triangles, you want to try and keep the triangles in groups. Just because, you know, just a single triangle leaf works, but often looks a little kind of odd, right? So when you're putting them on your tree, try and build your triangles in groups. So I made 3 right there, and then I'll make a couple right there, a couple 3 right there. And again, try and like work them in diagonals. They don't always have to be a specific tight diagonal. But it's sort of this kind of like lumps that build on top of one another are what make the tree, the leaves, and the arrangement of the leaves look natural. All right? And yeah, I don't know, we're missing some in here. So there you go. There are some basic approaches to making leaves and making trees. Now, I'm not going to go through it, but if we were to go and make another tree, all right, what we would do was we'd follow the same process, all right, and sometimes you can do multiple trees at the same time, right? But you would want to make sure that you overlap your trees, but you don't make them touch, if that makes sense, right? So if I was doing here, I'm going to do like a little tree that's kind of behind this guy. And there we go, right? And I would leave, you see how they don't touch? That's on purpose. I would leave that open. You don't want them to be butt right up against each other. It's, you know, places for the imagination to soar. So there's the, you know, I did this really quick. But, you know, there's the tree that's behind our other, you know, our first tree. All right? And so I hope you can see, as we were saying before, the things that are closest to the viewer are at the bottom. See, this tree's lower. And the things that are furthest from the viewer move up on the top. All right, so that's some trees. You can have a good time painting trees. And you know, what's a landscape without a couple of rocks? All right, if you remember from the painting that I showed you before, there's lots of rocks. That painting before actually comes from, you know, I was on a hike in northern Georgia in the United States, and saw something like that. I just thought it was cool, these two trees growing out of a rock. I've painted that scene a bunch of times. That one I showed you is probably not my best. The best one is sitting in a box in storage somewhere in the United States. Or maybe I gave it away. I do that. If you ever want a painting, I don't charge people. You can just ask for one. Actually, all right, we're going to do rocks, but I'm going to switch to watercolor just so you can see that you don't necessarily have to use the Chinese materials. So I'm pause the video, give me a moment to get set up, and then I'll show you rocks. All right, so the reason that we took a little break is because with the cake watercolors like I use, you have to let them soften up a little bit before you use them. So when I turn the video off, put a little bit of water on the cake so that it gets nice and soft. And then that way you can get a good mark. So I'm going to use my Chinese student brush again. And I just decided to use green instead of black. You just change it up a little bit. All right, so we're going to talk about rocks now. Now there's all different shapes and forms of rocks. We're just going to do basic rock shape. All right. The way it works is it's like the leaves. You get into sort of a pattern or approach, right? When you're making a rock, you start kind of down at the bottom. You can pick left or right side, whatever makes you happiest, right? Kind of go up a little bit, all right? Give it kind of a nice assertive stroke there. And then when you get to the top of the rock, press your brush a little bit more, right? And then as you come down the other side, use that like kind of flat belly side of the brush to make another heavy assertive stroke. And then you can kind of make the bottom of your rock. All right, there we go, rock. We'll make a couple of rocks here. I'll make a little bit bigger one so you can see the next thing. And you can do all different kind of shapes of rocks. If you noticed in Chinese painting, there's sometimes these really odd kind of, I don't know, very almost abstract looking kind of rocks in there. You can get into it. That's sort of when as you're exploring and playing around with it and doing it a little bit more. Now you got the outline of the rock, and that's a good start, but it still doesn't. Right now, it's still just kind of this blob on the paper. You want to give it some of the lines and some of the shading. So start with some darker ink, or in my case, some darker paint, and put some lines in the rock, and you want to curve them so the rock has this kind of round feeling to it, right? I know there are flat rocks out there. We're going to go with the kind of the round feeling, right? And you start with some, and then maybe even some a line over here that kind of shows a crack in the rock. All right. Now, once you've got those darker lines in there, then you want to add some lighter lines to it. All right, to give that kind of variation in the shadow and in the tone of the rock. So I put a little bit of water on my palette, and then I'm going to put some paint into the water. All right, so because then it's going to be more translucent, it's going to be lighter, so that there'll be a little bit of contrast. Now I'm drying my brush off. This is one of the things that these Chinese brushes are designed to hold a lot of water. So sometimes if you want a really precise line, you got to use this extra paper to dry your paper off a bit. All right, and then go in there with some of the lighter paint, go over the top, and this works with ink too. I do exactly the same thing on ink, and add a little bit more tone and shadow, and you can maybe even add a little bit off to the side there. All right, so once again, give your rock a little bit of roundedness. You can go over some of your lines before. And then put a little bit of lighter paint or ink or whatever you happen to be using right over the top of it. Now this works with the marker too, and since I've got the marker here, I'm going to show you. The only real limitation that you have with the marker is that you don't get the lighter colors unless you've got a bunch of different colored markers. But I'll start, and I'm going to hold the marker the same way, all right? The marker's smaller, so I'm not using all my fingers, right? You can see that. I'm using just 2 of the fingers. But I'll start with the shape on top of the rock, and then I might have to add some extra lines in here, and then bring down a nice kind of assertive rock shape and a line. Now, with the marker, you're going to have to go over the lines a little bit more to get a thicker, heavier line. But the process works the same. You can see, there we go. There's my marker rock. This is a particularly fine marker. If you have one of those big Crayolas that have like kind of the multiple sides to it, then I think the process might be sped up a little bit. But there you go. There's some simple rocks. Hooray for the rock. Okay, so we're going to finish off our landscape painting with some mountains. I filled out the trees a little bit, and I turned some of our leaf examples into a rock, and so we're going to go for that S curve again, right? Where I'm going to come over here, we'll do some mountains, kind of up like that, all right, so that we can kind of follow this S curve. So I was reading a biography of Leonardo da Vinci and also looking at his artwork, and I noticed some blue mountains in his paintings that looked a lot like the way we do Chinese paintings. So I've never done this before. I'm gonna try and do some blue mountains, even though it's gonna be kind of a quirky, odd painting, but it's good fun. So with the mountain, you want to start at the top of the mountain, all right? Usually you want some kind of good defining part of the mountain, that kind of that edge. All right. Now you notice I'm using thicker but not thick paint. I do the same thing with ink, because as the things are further away, they're also a little bit less defined. All right. So I'd add a little bit in there, and then we get off into that mountain. Now I remember the mountains in Lausanne kind of had this nice sloping edge to them. All right, so that's the way I'm going to do it. If you've ever seen those Chinese paintings of really kind of wild-looking mountains, right? They look all kind of odd shapes. There is a part of China where they really do look like that. I was surprised. I visited there once, and I was surprised. And Chinese landscape painting made a lot of sense to me. So I've kind of got the outline of the mountain, and then, in parts of the mountains, you're going to have cliffs, and you're going to have edges that add a little bit more interest to it. All right, so I'm going to put a little bit in there, and then maybe I'll even kind of put like an edge cliff. Notice I'm kind of using the belly of the brush, and I'm kind of pushing forward with it. That's a neat thing about these brushes. So now that I've got kind of an outline of my mountain there, I'm going to do just like we did with the rock, and I'm going to add some lighter lines next to and over the top of the darker lines to add some of that variation, that play between light and dark and shadow that you get. All right, and I like to give my brush a little squiggle, while I'm painting it. Remember, I made a little bit of a mistake there. Give your trees some breathing space. Now, we won't see it as much here with the watercolor paint, but you would see it in the ink. When the ink's still wet and you add water to it, I'll show you in a minute how that works. You can make that color flow a little bit. All right, and so there we go. And then I'm going to add another mountain up here, a little bit. Here, I'll do it with the ink so I can show you what I was talking about. Load up my brush with some ink there. I want a little bit lighter ink color. I don't want that black because I don't want it to compete with the tree down here. So there we go, the top of my mountain. And then watch this, because this is a fun stroke. I didn't really go into it. Because the ink is still wet, I can just use water right out of my brush, and I can kind of pull the ink down, and it'll fade, and it'll draw some of that black in there, and some of that down, and so that you get these kind of nice. You can even add just a little bit of ink over the top of it. All right, so it'll give it some of that nice, those transitions. In oil painting and in Western style painting, we do this by adding different layers, really thin layers of color. But in Chinese painting, what we're going for is using the water to our advantage to make these kind of changes in tone and gradation. All right, well, there we go. I know this is maybe not, this is kind of a painting that's all over the place, but I hope you got to see some of the techniques and how this works. Give me just a minute. I'll get some photos of some finished paintings for you to look at, and then it'll be time to go for it yourself. So here's a finished painting that I completed a while back. This is more complex than the demonstration I gave you. But this is one of the ones that came from, like some things that I'd seen walking around Lausanne, as well as, some things that I added from my imagination. And kind of, I wanted you to see a completed painting, but I also wanted to talk about how what we've done today is really just scratch the surface of everything that's out there. Like, we didn't touch base on the Chinese painting history. We didn't talk about the developments, like the different styles that people have approached. We didn't discuss like the difference between the scholarly paintings and the court paintings, and so there's a whole lot out there if you really want to know, not just using the techniques and the skills, but a lot of like really strong. It's got a rich history of composition, and it's really quite enjoyable. So I hope this has piqued your interest some, and I hope to see what you've created.